And so if they actually tried to dilute the market, you would be able to see it happening and complain.
But what additional guarantees? I serve on public company boards. We can issue additional stock with the board approval, and granted the stock might go down because an analyst will say this, or your stock's about to become diluted. But why do coins necessarily, is it a trust thing to come out of the gates and say we're going to tie this to some sort of finite or limiting mechanism? Because you can issue more stock, a company can issue more stock.
Yeah, it's not so easy with these tokens because they are in the form of smart contracts. And what this is a computer program that contains all the constraints and variables. And one of the things that appears in every token smart contract is a limit on how many there could ever be. Now, you might get clever and say, there can only be 1 million of these tokens, but then I'm going to create
a new token.
Alpha token, Beta token.
Model X token.
Yeah, and this is meant to be a perfect substitute, and we'll create another. And would they really be valued in the market? Would they give access to the same platform and replicate the first token? I'm not so sure that they would. So the scalability and replication of tokens, you really haven't seen anybody try this yet because these platforms are all years into the future. But it is often remarked that the governance of these things and the enforcement of the smart contract terms may end up to be the weakness, the Achilles heel, if people can do as you conjectured. We'll have to see if there are shady people and companies that are able to program around the constraints in the smart contracts. You do see this in the debt markets where there's covenants against future borrowing, but people find ways around it by issuing new debt of more junior grade or whatever.
Yeah, blank secure debt. So the first 6 months of 2018 versus the first 6 months of 2017, number of ICOs, capital raised, stability of the market, how does it look year on year?
Vastly more capital has been raised. That ICOs at this point last year were still a novelty, and you were just starting to see the beginning of the wave. But we're now into a market that is, probably going to raise somewhere between 3 to 5 billion in the first half of this year in ICOs. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of new issues. You also, a year ago, didn't have the beginnings yet of the big run-up in the crypto values. The big march from about 2,000 to 20,000 in the value of Bitcoin was mostly something at the tail end of last year. We had then something of a collapse in January, but now, really a 3-month rally in February, March, April, and so forth.
So whenever you see this sort of adoption, it usually indicates that the incumbent got greedy and had fat margins and was sticking its chin out. Is the backstory here that investment banks with 7% fees on IPOs and venture capitalists with extremely costly forms of capital, isn't this basically, doesn't the ICO market, if it ever becomes legitimate, essentially say that banks and venture capitalists got greedy or fat and weren't adding the value that their fees justified?
I think that's exactly right. People have been looking for an alternative source of entrepreneurial finance. Going public through the equity market's extraordinarily expensive because you have the 7% commission, but you also have the tendency to underprice the shares by 10% and very, very high compliance costs to meet the requirements of the SEC. So I'm not sure that the investment banks are all alone in this, that a lot of people have thought that the several rounds of regulation, the Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank laws and so forth, they made it so onerous for a firm to list itself publicly that we've observed IPOs vastly reduced. IPOs have all but stopped over the last decade in the US. And you're seeing firms like Uber, Airbnb really indefinitely staying off the exchanges when ordinarily they may have gone public in the last generation.
So could Uber offer a coin that says, could you have an Uber coin that says unlimited free rides to this individual and the blockchain just tracks your identity to make sure you're not abusing it? And
biometrically with your fingerprint.
Right, because I spend $1,000 a month on Uber, $12,000 discount, cap rate of 5. So what is that? That's 200. I mean, that's a $250,000 coin supposedly, right?
I would think that a lot of these fintech companies, especially the ones in the peer-to-peer markets like ride sharing, might find it very appealing to have their own currency. It's even suggested that Amazon might put Amazon coin out there. Because they're increasingly...
But it sounds like it needed to be a prime coin because you'd want to directly link to something that you could value, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but they've got all these retail platforms now with, they were originally a bookstore and now they've got Whole Foods and everything in between.
What I don't understand there, Professor Yermak, is if I buy an Amazon coin and I can't have ownership, I'm getting the rights to the future product, does that mean I get unlimited everything from Amazon? You'd have
That's
to bound
up to
it,
Amazon.
right?
Yeah, they might just give you priority as a customer, to think about
Prime.
Yeah, Prime.
The Prime coin.
The airlines could do this and sell elite status or
Right.
gold status and so forth. I think that you're going to see some innovation in the business and revenue models, and that for the very big media companies, having their own currency, especially since they're multinationals, might be very
It just
attractive.
feels like it's so right. It seems to me you want to attach it to a recurring revenue charge stream so people feel like they can value it. So Netflix feels perfect.
Yeah.
Spotify coin feels perfect.
I gave this as an exam question in a course last year. Should Amazon issue Amazon coin? And there are various pros and cons, including the fact that Amazon has a big footprint in the U.S. markets and issues equity and wants to keep the SEC and the IRS happy. If they saw this as a method for tax evasion, it might get them in trouble in their mainline business.
So you're involved in the joint program with the law school.
Yeah.
If you were advising a kid who was platform agnostic and was an athlete, equal skills across all dimensions, and was just an economic animal, would you say the sweet spot over the next 5 to 10 years is to be an entrepreneur leveraging on ICO, to be a crypto miner, to be a lawyer putting together these white papers, selling picks to the miners? Where do you think on a risk-adjusted basis the best place to play is if you're young and your most valuable asset is your human capital and you want to make an investment in this space?
I think all the things you listed are possibilities, but the lawyers are going to be very busy.
Yeah, it feels that way.
I had underestimated the need for lawyers, although this is why we started our course, was to train lawyers to help write the regulation. But it seems like there are so many novel legal questions that you see the law firms starting up big crypto blockchain practices. So I think, if you want interesting work at the cutting edge, going to law school to learn to be a blockchain lawyer is a pretty smart career choice. And I do think that the hardware is a big opportunity, that faster mining machines are really, really valuable, and I don't expect the demand for these to go down anytime soon. There's a really funny story in the news yesterday about a bunch of mining machines that were stolen from Iceland, and then they resurfaced maybe in China, where people had taken them to hook them up to an illicit power source where they disconnected the meters so that they weren't paying for the electricity. But this is the kind of stuff that bank robbers do to get the stuff out of the country into a safe haven. And if you have an innovation in mining hardware, you could get quite rich, although the half-life of these things is maybe 18 months at most. But still,
The half-life of the technology.
yeah, the technology is constantly being improved upon. But to be part of that innovation, I think there's a lot of value added, and you would have no trouble finding work. In fact, you would probably start your own firm and try to market the stuff yourself.
But isn't crypto mining similar to petroleum in the sense that the refining equipment is costly, but it's largely been commoditized, you have access to it, that the cost of the end is the oil, which is electricity?
No, you're still seeing a huge J curve in terms of the productivity and the the technology coming down in cost. This will eventually plateau out. That's why you think of it as the shape of a J. But for now, the comparative advantage is really the hardware, and the hardware can be energy efficient. If it saves you on the electrical bill, or if it doesn't get overheated, or if it just can do the computations more quickly. Any and all of those things can be a comparative advantage. There's intense interest when new mining machines come onto the market. And some of the coins, there's actually been controversies about maybe we should reprogram the code to keep these new miners off of the chain.
So how do you play that? I know NVIDIA is one way to play that, but who sells into the tech that you can make money off of?
I think a lot of the big IC chip makers are making profits off of this. There are people who build these things, but they're really assembling component parts. And I think companies like Intel and Samsung are selling a lot of chips. There's just a lot of demand for computer hardware in this circuit from many of the classical vendors. But I would do some market research on exactly which firms. I've read, though, that many of the old computer companies that are very familiar names are finding.
Well, Intel just hit a 52-week high, or Intel's all of a sudden, and it hadn't even dawned on me that was part of it.
No, I would be surprised if they weren't indirectly participating in this by just selling raw material to many of the manufacturers. It's hard to build, in very large quantity, any computer machinery without Intel somehow having a foot in it.
So I spoke this morning, and after me at an event, and after me was this kid who's raised a ton of money, and he goes around financing crypto mines or crypto mining, and basically he roams the earth looking for the cheapest source of electricity,
Right.
and then sets up a crypto mine, and then I think sells the products or the equipment into the crypto miners. Are you seeing a lot of that sort of, these like almost roaming nomadic businesses?
No, there's been some great news stories, and what you need is cheap electricity and cool weather so that you can buy the electricity cheap and then just open the window to keep your computers from overheating. So where's this going to be? Yeah, Iceland, in fact, is the #1 location, but northern Canada.
Isn't northern Canada the North Pole?
Yes, no, some of these things are above the Arctic Circle, but you're thinking tundra. And there is a lot of renewable energy, you know, high winds and hydropower locally available.
This feels like an A&E miniseries or reality TV, not king crab fishermen.
No, this would be a
miners.
fun TV series about the life of a miner, because you're in difficult conditions, like those people who travel to the South Pole but can't really go outside. So there's probably whole soap operas that take place behind the scenes. But in the end, you're just trying to run computers at very high speeds without having them overheat. And it turns out that the optimum conditions for this are far from civilization. You know, the further north you go, the easier the conditions become.
So last thing, Professor Yermak, and you're you reek of integrity and you don't like to make predictions, but I want to ask if there's any predictions you'd be willing to make. If Bitcoin end of year, do you see it, if you had to pick higher, lower, or the same, any gut for it right now?
My gut from day one has been that this thing is incredibly overvalued. I can't believe.
Incredibly overvalued.
Yeah, and I've been wrong about this. Yeah, so don't take my advice.
But that's your gut. Your gut is it's overvalued.
Yeah, and you know, I get asked all the time, how many Bitcoins do you own? And it's like 0. Are you kidding me? Yeah, this is really, really risky. It's hard to know if something's going to go up or down, but I'm pretty comfortable predicting that the ride will be a wild one, because volatility has been very characteristic of these assets from day one. And there was a period of a couple of years where the volatility was trending down, but in the last year it's exploded again. And I think that this is not for the faint of heart. I think that most of the coins you see in the market will go to 0, but that's also true of most of the stocks on the stock exchange. You know, sooner or later, it's a question of when. There will be a few, though, that are going to be very, very successful. And if people have the insight to identify those today, they are very good investments, but very hard to know what they are.
Even if crypto and Bitcoin isn't the success tangibly that we think it might be, isn't it likely we're going to see a major erosion in value among traditional financial services firms just because of the threat?
Yeah, and the blockchain technology makes many of the people who work in these organizations unnecessary. Blockchains are a real breakthrough in record keeping. They are a self-auditing ledger. So anyone whose job is keeping track of things, and this would be most auditors, most bankers, the people at the clearinghouse on the stock exchange, I think those jobs won't exist a generation from now.
So are you bearish on financial services from a valuation standpoint?
I would not be going long these firms unless you think that they will magically transition themselves into new modern organizations, but given the regulations they face, that seems very unlikely.
And does anyone stand out as being really aggressive around, I mean, they're smart people with a lot of capital. Someone told me Bank of America was turning into, you know, a tech firm, that they are making huge investments around
They're trying,
this.
yeah. I think they've gotten far past the denial. And even at JP Morgan, where the CEO said that Bitcoin was a fraud, there's an awful lot of blockchain stuff going on in the guts of the organization. But whether they can reinvent themselves quickly enough and whether the regulators will permit this, I think is, you know, an even bigger question. And I think what is likely to happen is that financial services will be encroached upon by people like telecom industry, who can get into the payments business and already have, by media companies, by people like Google and Apple and so forth, who will, like vultures, pick off the profitable parts of the business and leave the low-cost, low-margin stuff for the banks.
And what's happened to our enrollments or applications for the fintech specialization at Stern? I think I know the answer.
Yeah, there's a lot of demand. We continue to add courses and look for new faculty to teach these topics. And we're just going through the course lottery right now for next year. But I'm offering 2 sections of my course instead of 1, which it's been up till now. And I think we'll be adding more and more courses.
And the demand is there? Recruiters want to hire these kids?
Yeah, and Still, it's a lot of the old firms, though, they're looking to hire in these new wildcat divisions. So, JP Morgan may be recruiting software engineers and big data people as opposed to MBAs. But the recruiting profile has changed. That our biggest recruiter today is Amazon.
Yeah.
And it used to be Citi.
14 kids in my class Tuesday night. 14 kids are going to Amazon.
And Amazon, if they're not thinking of themselves as a finance company in some way, shape, or form, are missing the point. I'm sure that they're...
Yeah, but what aren't they? What kind of company aren't they at this point? Professor David Yermak, head of our FinTech specialization at NYU Stern and chairs the Department of Finance at Stern. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you, Scott.